Imagine this. A new law says newspapers must get government approval before publishing. A journalist argues this violates freedom of expression. The case goes to the Constitutional Court, which must decide, is the law valid or must it be struck down? This is the power of judicial review. Courts protecting constitutional rights against laws or actions that go too far. In this lesson, we will learn how to explain constitutional rights and judicial review in clear, professional legal English. This lesson is part of our complete legal English program for lawyers and legal professionals. For full lessons, live sessions, and expert support, join our legal English community. The link is in the description. By the end of today's lesson, you'll be able to use vocabulary like fundamental rights, equality, separation of powers, Bill of Rights, judicial review, constitutional court, constitutionality, and amendment. Explain constitutional rights and government limits using modal verbs like must, may, and must not. Apply legal phrases such as protect fundamental rights, strike down a law, limit government power, and interpret the Constitution. Use key expressions like constitutional challenge, judicial independence, checks and balances, and unconstitutional act. This will help you explain constitutional rights and judicial review step by step in legal English. Let's begin with a story. Parliament passes a new law. All public protests must receive government approval at least 60 days in advance. A group of citizens argues this law violates our fundamental rights to free expression and assembly. They bring a constitutional challenge before the Constitutional Court. The judge reviews the case. The Constitution guarantees the right to peaceful protest. The government may regulate protest for safety, but it cannot eliminate the right entirely. This law goes too far and is therefore unconstitutional. The court strikes down the law. Citizens may continue to exercise their rights, but still must comply with reasonable safety regulations. This story shows how judicial review protects rights by checking government power. Fundamental rights are at the heart of every constitution. They protect citizens from abuses of state power and guarantee freedoms that cannot be taken away by ordinary laws. For example, freedom of expression is a fundamental right. Let's look at a story. A university student organizes a peaceful protest against rising tuition fees. The local mayor orders police to stop the protest and fines the student organizer. The students consult a lawyer who says the Constitution guarantees the right to freedom of expression and peaceful assembly. These are fundamental rights. Unless the protest turns violent, the government cannot stop it. The lawyer files a petition in Constitutional Court. The court rules in favor of the students. The right to protest peacefully is a fundamental right. The mayor's order is unconstitutional. This case shows that the fundamental rights are the ultimate shield for citizens in a democracy, and lawyers must know how to invoke them effectively. Equality means no person is above the law, and no one should face discrimination because of race, gender, religion, or social status. For example, the Constitution guarantees equality before the law. Let's look at another story. A woman applies for a promotion at a state-owned company, but is rejected because the job announcement said men only. She files a claim. Her lawyer explains the Constitution guarantees equality. The state must treat all citizens fairly. Gender discrimination violates constitutional equality provisions. The case goes to court, and the judge rules equality is a fundamental principle. The hiring policy is discriminatory and therefore unconstitutional. Equality provisions are powerful. They allow courts to challenge systemic discrimination and ensure fairness in society. Separation of powers ensures no single branch of government has unlimited control. Legislatures pass laws, executives enforce them, and courts interpret them. The separation of powers prevents abuse of authority, in theory. In a country facing political tension, the president issues a decree extending his term in office beyond the constitutional limit. Opposition politicians file a challenge. The Constitutional Court hears the case and states the president cannot extend his term unilaterally. The Constitution establishes separation of powers. Only the legislature can change electoral laws, and even then, must respect constitutional limits. The court strikes down the decree, reminding everyone the separation of powers protects democracy. Without it, one branch could dominate the others and endanger citizens' rights. This principle is the backbone of constitutional law everywhere. The Bill of Rights is most famously part of the U.S. Constitution, the first 10 amendments adopted in 1791. It protects rights like speech, religion, assembly, and due process. For example, the U.S. Bill of Rights includes freedom of speech and religion. Let's look at a story. A journalist writes a critical article about government corruption. Officials threaten to close the newspaper. The editor's lawyer argues the First Amendment, part of the U.S. Bill of Rights, protects freedom of the press. The government cannot silence criticism. The case reaches the U.S. Supreme Court, which confirms the press plays a vital role in democracy. Government censorship violates the Bill of Rights. And while most Latin American constitutions don't use the phrase Bill of Rights, instead they include a catalog of fundamental rights directly in the constitutional text. Courts protect these rights through judicial review and constitutional remedies, such as the writ of amparo. Judicial review allows courts to act as guardians of the Constitution. They check whether laws or government actions respect constitutional limits. The court used judicial review to cancel the law. For example, a parliament passes a law requiring social media users to register with the government. Civil society organizations file a constitutional challenge. In court, the lawyer argues this law violates freedom of expression and privacy. Judicial review allows the court to strike it down. The Constitutional Court agrees the state cannot impose unnecessary restrictions on communication. The law is unconstitutional. This illustrates how judicial review balances government power with citizen rights. A constitutional court has one mission: to protect the Constitution. It decides disputes over whether laws, government policies, or executive actions respect constitutional limits. For example, the Constitutional Court ruled the law unconstitutional. Let's look at a story. A law restricts online speech and allows censorship without judicial approval. A group of lawyers brings the case to the Constitutional Court. After hearings, the court declares this law is disproportionate. It violates freedom of expression. It is unconstitutional. Some countries have a special constitutional court: Germany, Colombia, Guatemala, while others assign this role to their Supreme Court: Mexico, Argentina. No matter the structure, the goal is the same: defending the Constitution. Constitutionality means testing whether a law, regulation, or government action follows the Constitution. If not, it is unconstitutional and invalid. An example: the lawyer questioned the constitutionality of the new law. Let's look at this story. A new law bans foreign journalists from covering elections. International organizations file a challenge. In court, the lawyers argue This restriction violates freedom of the press. Its constitutionality must be reviewed. The judges agree. This law is not constitutional. It violates democratic guarantees. Constitutionality is at the core of constitutional litigation. Lawyers constantly argue whether laws are consistent with the supreme law of the land. An amendment is an official modification to the Constitution. Because constitutions are supreme, amendments usually require special procedures, such as supermajorities or referendums. For example, the Constitution was amended to extend voting rights. Let's look at a story. In 1971, during the Vietnam War, the U.S. Constitution was amended to lower the voting age from 21 to 18. Citizens argued, reasonably, if young people are old enough to be drafted into the army, they must also be old enough to vote. In Latin America, constitutions are often amended more frequently. For example, Mexico's constitution has been amended hundreds of times since 1917. Each amendment reflects political and social changes while still preserving the Constitution's authority as the highest law. Must expresses a strict legal obligation, something that is required by the Constitution. The government must respect fundamental rights. This is the highest duty of any democratic state. For example, courts must review laws for constitutionality. Judicial review is not optional. It is required to protect the legal system. Let's look at a story. A parliament passes a law limiting freedom of religion. Citizens file a challenge. The Constitutional Court explains the government must protect freedom of religion, even if the majority disagrees. This duty comes directly from the Constitution, and using must shows that there is no choice. It is a mandatory constitutional requirement. May expresses formal permission granted by law or the Constitution. It often describes what citizens are allowed to do or what government is authorized to do under certain conditions. First example, citizens may challenge a law in constitutional court. The Constitution gives people this right. Second example, Parliament may amend the Constitution under strict procedures. This shows a legal possibility, not a guarantee. Let's take a look at a more detailed example. In Mexico, a lawyer explains to a client, you may file a writ of amparo if your rights are violated. The Constitution allows this special procedure. May highlights the space of legal permission, what is possible under constitutional law. Must not and cannot express prohibitions, things that are forbidden under the Constitution. They are especially powerful in constitutional law because they protect individuals against government abuse. First example, the government must not discriminate on the basis of race. This is an absolute prohibition. Second example, a law cannot violate freedom of expression. If it does, it will be struck down. Third example, Parliament cannot pass laws that contradict the Constitution. Even lawmakers are bound by constitutional limits. Let's look at it in more detail. A government passes a law requiring newspapers to get approval before publishing political content. The court rules this law cannot stand. It must not restrict freedom of the press. Parliament cannot limit rights in this way because the Constitution is supreme. This use of must not and cannot makes the limits of state power clear and non-negotiable. To protect fundamental rights is the central role of constitutional courts. Whenever government actions threaten freedom of expression, equality, or due process, courts must intervene. For example, the court must protect fundamental rights. Looking at it in more detail, a government passes a law requiring journalists to register with authorities before publishing. Civil society groups argue this violates freedom of expression, a fundamental right. The case reaches the Constitutional Court. The judges review the law and state, our role is to protect fundamental rights. Freedom of expression cannot be restricted in this way. The law is struck down. And here, the phrase is more than legal jargon. It explains the mission of constitutional justice, protecting citizens from state overreach. To strike down a law means the court removes it from the legal system because it violates the Constitution. Once struck down, the law has no effect. Example, the Constitutional Court struck down the new censorship law. An example in more detail. Parliament passes a law banning protest within 5 kilometers of government buildings. Citizens argue this law eliminates the right to peaceful assembly. The Constitutional Court examines the law. The judges explain the Constitution guarantees freedom of assembly. This restriction is excessive. We strike down this law as unconstitutional. Striking down a law is one of the most powerful checks courts have against abusive legislation. It demonstrates that the Constitution always comes first. To limit government power means ensuring the state cannot go beyond what the Constitution allows. This principle balances authority with liberty. For example, the Constitution limits government power. And in more detail, let's look at this one. During a crisis, the executive declares a state of emergency and orders indefinite detention without trial. Lawyers challenge this in court, arguing the government cannot detain people without judicial review. The Constitution limits government power, even in emergencies. The court agrees. While emergency allows temporary measures, they do not justify abolishing fundamental rights. The Constitution limits what government may do. This phrase shows how constitutions create boundaries. Even strong leaders must act within them. To interpret the Constitution means to explain what its provisions mean in practice. Because constitutions use broad language like freedom of expression, courts must define how these rights apply in real cases. Example, the court must interpret the Constitution to decide the case. A story. The Constitution says everyone has the right to privacy. A new law allows police to access cell phone records without a warrant. Citizens challenge it. The Constitutional Court must interpret the Constitution. Does privacy include digital communications? Must a warrant be required? The judges conclude, yes, privacy extends to modern technology. The government must obtain a warrant. The Constitution must be interpreted in a way that protects rights in a contemporary society. This phrase emphasizes the dynamic role of courts, not just enforcing, but actively shaping the meaning of the Constitution through interpretation. A constitutional challenge is when lawyers or citizens formally question whether a law or action is consistent with the Constitution. For example, the lawyers filed a constitutional challenge against the new law. Let's look at a story in more detail. Parliament passes a law requiring all online platforms to remove political content not approved by the government. Civil rights groups argue that the law destroys freedom of expression. They file a constitutional challenge. The court examines the case and rules. The law violates fundamental rights. Through this challenge, we declare the law unconstitutional. This expression describes one of the most common procedures in constitutional litigation, directly testing laws against the Constitution. Judicial independence means that courts and judges cannot be controlled by politicians, parties, or outside interests. Without independence, judicial review loses credibility. Example, judicial independence is essential for fair decisions. In a country facing political conflict, the president pressures the courts to support new emergency laws. Judges receive threats and intimidation. One judge speaks publicly, "I cannot work or rule under these conditions." Judicial independence is at risk. Later, the Constitutional Court issues a strong opinion. Independence of the judiciary is a cornerstone of democracy. Without it, citizens lose protection against abuse of power. This principle explains why protecting courts from outside influence is as important as protecting rights themselves. Checks and balances means that the legislative, executive, and judicial powers control one another to maintain balance. Example, checks and balances prevent abuse of power. Let's look at a story in more detail. The legislature passes a law granting the president unlimited authority to issue decrees. The president accepts eagerly, but soon the judiciary intervenes. The court explains checks and balances means no branch can give away or take unlimited power. This law is unconstitutional. Later, citizens realize, thanks to checks and balances, no single authority can dominate the system. This phrase shows how constitutional design prevents the rise of unchecked authority. An unconstitutional act is any law, decree, or action that conflicts with the Constitution. Once declared unconstitutional, it loses all legal effect. For example, the ban on peaceful protest was declared an unconstitutional act. And let's look at a very detailed example. A mayor orders the closure of all opposition newspapers. So what do lawyers do? They immediately respond. This is an unconstitutional act. Freedom of the press is guaranteed by the Constitution. The case goes to the Constitutional Court, and judges rule. This order is null and void. It is unconstitutional and cannot be enforced. This phrase is critical in practice. It marks the boundary where state action ends and the constitutional protection begins. Let's put everything together in one case. In a country with a written constitution, Parliament passes a law requiring all public demonstrations to be pre-approved by the Ministry of Security. The government claims we must maintain order. But citizens argue this law violates our fundamental rights to equality and free expression. The government cannot restrict peaceful protests in this way. Civil society groups file a constitutional challenge before the Constitutional Court. The lawyers argue the government must respect equality. It cannot approve some groups while rejecting others. The court may interpret the Constitution broadly to protect freedom of assembly. This decree is an unconstitutional act. It must be struck down. The Constitutional Court deliberates. Judges explain. The Constitution limits government power. Parliament must not pass laws that eliminate fundamental rights. Our duty is to protect fundamental rights and interpret the Constitution in light of democratic values. Through judicial review, we declare this law invalid. We hereby strike down the law. The decision reaffirms the principles of checks and balances and judicial independence. Courts ensure that even the majority cannot override fundamental right. The case becomes a landmark, showing that constitutional courts exist not to serve politicians, but to guarantee citizens' freedoms. Let's review what we covered in today's lesson on constitutional rights and judicial review. First, we explored vocabulary, fundamental rights, freedoms guaranteed by the Constitution, equality, the guarantee of equal treatment before the law, separation of powers, dividing government authority to prevent abuse, Bill of Rights, a section of some constitutions that list rights, especially in the U.S., judicial review, The power of courts to check laws against the Constitution. Constitutional court, the court that decides constitutional disputes. Constitutionality, whether law agrees with the Constitution. And amendment, a formal change to the Constitution. Second, we practice grammar. Must for legal duties. The government must respect rights. May for permission. Citizens may challenge a law. Must not and cannot for prohibitions. Parliament cannot pass unconstitutional laws. Third, we applied legal phrases. Protect fundamental rights. The court's main role. Strike down a law. Declare a law invalid. Or limit government power, which ensures the state stays within the Constitution. Interpret the Constitution. Explain and apply constitutional text. Fourth, we learned key expressions. Constitutional challenge, testing laws in court. Judicial independence, keeping judges free from pressure. Checks and balances, preventing concentration of power. And unconstitutional act, when a law or action violates the Constitution. Finally, we saw a wrap-up story. Citizens filed a constitutional challenge against a restrictive protest law, and the Constitutional Court struck it down, reaffirming judicial independence and the protection of fundamental rights. Now, you can explain constitutional rights and judicial review clearly with the vocabulary, grammar, and legal phrases that lawyers use in practice. If you would like more lessons like this, please join our Legal English community. The link is in the description.